The Rebel Capitalist Show.
I like to try to think about why we had the inflation in the 40s and then why we had it in the 70s, because it was much different. And then look at the environment we have today in the 2020s and ask ourselves the question, is the 2020s going to be more like the 1940s from a standpoint of probabilities, or more like the 1970s? And I think this really pertains to not only real estate investors, but probably a lot of owner occupants out there, because they have a 30-year fixed rate mortgage.
Right.
Obviously,
Yeah.
inflation is what you want, because you want to pay that back with cheaper dollars.
Yep.
So let's go into a screen share. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah, this is from Alhambra, from Jeff Snyder's
From
group,
Snyder,
right? Yeah.
Okay, so what we've got here, Jason, and you just pegged it. This is from our good friend Jeff Snyder. And this is Treasury market inflation component. This is from his blog, but he goes back to 1943. And the shaded gray area is the level of inflation. And he takes it up to 8%. I know this one right here that my pointer is over, that got up to almost 19%.
Wow.
Believe it or not, right there in 1947, 48, extremely high. But then you'll notice this time frame between 49 and 50, we actually had deflation, not disinflation, but prices were going down by about, I think, -2, -3% per year. And then 1951, we have a huge supply shock again because of the Korean War.
Mm-hmm.
So what Jeff is doing here is he's pointing out the fact that, according to his definition, what we saw in the 1940s really was not inflation, because it wasn't an increase, a substantial increase or a consistent increase in the overall money supply created by the commercial banks. It was really due to these, or mostly due to these supply shocks we saw during World War II, post-war supply shock, and then going into the Korean War. But he said all that changed in about 1957, when yields really started to go up on the 10-year and start going up consistently, where we had higher highs and higher lows. And then that's when we really had the commercial banking system printing more and more and more money, which brings us into an environment where we have more secular inflation. So here we had these spurts of inflation in the 1940s, where starting in the 1950s into the 1970s, we had more persistent rates of inflation that gradually increased in size. So what are your thoughts so far? And then I'll go into kind of some takeaways with what we're seeing right now in the 2020s.
Well, I mean, it's hard for me to tell. You've studied the 40s a lot more than I have. I really study the 70s a lot. So I know quite a bit about what happened in the 70s. But there's so much disruption and distortion in the market due to the war, right? I mean, that was just obviously a massive global change, and then the Marshall Plan coming out of it.
But same thing we've had with COVID as far as supply shocks. I mean, not due to a war, but it's still the same type of supply shocks.
Yeah, well, it's a war of ideas and a war for our freedom and our bodies. I'll tell you that. That's definitely it's a different kind of war. But yes, you're right.
Let's actually, let me pull up another chart that I got from another good friend of ours, Lynn Alden. And let's try to think through the 1940s from a standpoint of, if you would have had a 30-year fixed rate mortgage back during a time in which technically, if we're using the proper definition of inflation, or the Milton Friedman definition of inflation, where it's always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, we didn't really see this secular inflation due to these supply shocks. These are the charts from Lynn, where she points out first the inflation spikes we saw during the 1940s. And then here's those bouts of actual deflation, which I don't think we'll see today. But then she points out that it is true that this might not have been a monetary inflation the way Milton Friedman would define it. And they might have been temporary spikes, but each time it goes up, it's not like prices go back down to where they were in 1940. They go up to a high water mark, and they go up to a higher high water mark, and then an even higher high water mark here in 1952. So it's kind of this stair step approach.
Right.
So if you would have had a 30-year fixed rate mortgage in 1940, let's say on a rental property, what would rents have done by 1952?
Well, rents should have followed inflation. Now, keep in mind, I mean, back then, although I know this is a sort of hypothetical question, there wasn't much of an investor market at all. I mean, I doubt hardly anybody bought homes and rented them out. That really started with a guy named William Nickerson in the 50s, where he wrote some books about it and became quite famous for his day. He was like the world's first real estate guru, I think.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, yeah. There just wasn't much of this activity back then. I mean, a little bit of it happened, of course, but rents should have hedged inflation nicely. If
Yeah,
we can
right
take
here,
the more
Lynn
recent
points
times.
out that consumer prices increased 90%
Wow,
from
in 12 years.
1940,
Yeah,
yeah, to
yeah,
1952 to a permanent higher plateau. So I can almost promise you that rents would have gone up by probably the same number.
I agree with you. I just wonder. It's sort of hard to interpret the 40s, I think, because think about it. There was almost no trade. America was the only industrialized country after everything was destroyed in the war, right? And until we rebuilt Japan and Europe, I mean, we were it.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
the 50s was really a very optimistic time, other than the fallout shelters and the threat of nuclear war, which weighed heavy on people. It was a great time in America, really a time of prosperity, and all these, the automobile really took hold, and the American car companies they had no competition, so they were the big deal, right? So it yeah, it's just so different than it is today.
That's
But
a great point, because if the
yeah,
viewer is not following that, what Jason is saying is that now we have this global economy, so we can offshore a lot of that inflation, because in the 1940s to the 1950, from 40 to 52, pretty much everything that we can, not everything, I shouldn't say that, a large percentage of what we consumed would have been made right here in the United States.
yep.
Therefore, if prices are going up, if wages are going up, then that's going to have this spiraling effect, this positive feedback loop going higher and higher, higher. But now,
It
that
also meant that
isn't.
American workers had high paying factory jobs too, which
Yeah,
they don't have now, obviously. Yeah.
yeah, and because there's the option to take all of those goods that are being created and offshore them to places like China and Taiwan and all these other countries offshore or outside of the United States, to bring in those cheaper prices. So yeah, that is very true. It would be interesting to try to think through what would have happened to consumer price inflation in the 1940s or during this 12-year period if they would have been able to offshore a lot of that manufacturing to cheaper countries.
Yeah.
I think we still would have seen significant price inflation, but it probably wouldn't have been 90%, to your point.
Yeah, it's interesting. And George, I want to ask you something actually. Richard Nixon, of course he killed the gold standard issue in 1971 on August 15th. And then his historic trip to China, which was just amazing to people back then. It was a surprise. And I'm wondering if he knew the inflation that was about to come with LBJ, his predecessor's Great Society
Yeah,
initiatives, and
yeah.
the welfare state growing. And that's why he went to China, because China in 1978, George, as you know, really opened up, and it became the workshop of the world. If think about what would have happened if China never happened and we were just importing stuff from Europe and making stuff here, inflation would have been rampant in the US the
Yeah,
last several decades.
that's a great point. Yeah, and you combine that with if we would not have had the petrodollar.
Right? Yeah.
I mean,
And immigration from Mexico also to bring in the cheap labor. We got the cheap goods from China and the cheap labor from Mexico, right? So, yeah.
yeah, very interesting topic. And I think the main takeaway here for people is this inflation thing is complex. It's not just cut and dry. Oh, the government's printing money or the Fed's printing money,
Right.
therefore we're going to have inflation. Maybe, maybe not. There's a lot of different components that you need to consider. And also, in considering those components, it'll give you a better handle on what we will most likely see here in the 2020s. And that's, are we going to see inflation where we have these big spikes like the 1940s, or where we have something like the 1970s where inflation is more persistent and it's kind of this gradual climb up, although from year to year it's kind of going up and down. And then you combine that with, well, now we've got globalization to the tune of our trade deficit going from 40 billion a month to 80 billion a month. But then what makes it even more interesting is now if you do have a big recession in China, then because of what's happening with Evergrande and their real estate market, that means that they will produce less stuff. Therefore, they're going to consume a greater percentage of the stuff they're producing.
Right.
Therefore, they could have less stuff to export to the United States, where we're not going to make it here. We've got to go somewhere else. And most likely, if we do go somewhere else, even if it's offshore, it's going to be at a higher price. And then now we're importing the inflation that we have been exporting since the 1970s. So another variable. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you that it's another variable. The last bastion of cheap labor is Africa, and Africa is very messy and very fragmented. And that's, China is all over Africa. They're trying to also exploit the opportunities there. And, that's it. I mean, we've run out of cheap labor after that. Okay. And we may have really run out of it already. So it's dependent on technology and automation to continue to make cheap goods. And I just think there's a lot of inflationary pressures with all of these different factors.
I think my base case is we go through a 1940s, but the peaks in inflation are lower, and but we don't have the actual deflation. So as an example, let's just say that we're living through this spike right now that we saw in 1943, but today it's a 2021 version of this because of a supply shock. I think it's saying that the CPI went up to 8%. I think, maybe we go up to 8% here in 2021 or in 2022, but then 2023, maybe we go back down to maybe 4%. I don't think we'll go all the way down to zero or below zero. I think we'll always have inflation for a variety of reasons. But then, in maybe the 2025 or 2026, then we have a big spike up to maybe not 19%, but maybe it's 12%, 13%, 14%. And then we have something that crashes back down, but to a level higher than zero. And this is assuming that we still have the system of creating dollars we have today, where the commercial banks are largely responsible for that if the government isn't deficit spending that's being monetized by the Fed. If we have a central bank digital currency, then I think we're off to the races here with the 1970s.
Yeah. Well, if we have a Fed coin, that changes everything. I mean, that's game over. That's and if they make it so it's coordinated with other governments and central banks, and there's like no place to go, because that's what Janet Yellen is behind, this corporate minimum tax, and now a bunch of countries are agreeing to that.
Good point.
They're trying to make it so there's no place to run. Right? They're already controlling travel like crazy, and I've always said that. I was saying this back in 2003, 2004. The day there is a global fiat currency, it's checkmate. That's just like game over for humanity. They can do whatever they want. Now, that was before crypto. I didn't even know that was coming, right? But so, it's who knows? But I mean, overall, the future does look pretty inflationary to me.
Yeah, I think that's where I was going with it. Let's try to look at it through the lens of a real estate investor or an owner occupant with a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. And the takeaway here is, regardless of whether we go through a 1940s type scenario or we go into a 1970s type of scenario, you're going to be paying that thing back with cheaper dollars. That's for sure.
That mortgage, yeah.